Now, learning to drive has been a rite of passage in many societies for decades now, and it's been a central part of everyday life, especially if you live in a rural area where you don't have many alternatives. But what about if we become anxious about driving? And that could be for many reasons. How might it shape our life and our well-being? That's what I'm talking about today with Dr Joanne Taylor from Massey University here in New Zealand. So stay tuned for our conversation about driving anxiety. We normally start with asking people why they got interested in this topic in the first place. So maybe you can tell us that.
Oh gosh, that's a good question. It's got a very long history. I was interested in driving anxiety when I was doing my undergraduate degree and my master's papers. So this is some years ago now. So the transition into looking at older adults has been a more recent one. So originally I was interested in driving anxiety and what happens, what people's experience is after having a motor vehicle accident. So I'm a clinical psychologist, so I'm interested in, how people get along in the world and how people cope with difficult situations. And so this question popped up and started me on this programmatic research, I suppose, which at that stage was much more broad in terms of what is this phenomenon of driving anxiety. And it turned out, I guess, from my research and my master's degree, that people who have a lot of driving anxiety don't necessarily have that experience because of a vehicle crash. In fact, a lot of people have it for completely different reasons than that. So that was something that wasn't particularly well understood at that time, and led me on to my PhD, which was a much more in-depth exploration of this experience that people have. As well as what the relationships might be with people's actual driving skill level, and looking at it too from a diagnostic point of view. And it wasn't until after that I started working with the Health and Ageing Research team and looking at issues of mental health and specifically driving anxiety and fear in this older group. I suppose when I was doing my master's thesis and my PhD, it struck me that anecdotally a lot of the participants that were involved in both of those pieces of work were older women. And the master's research was a survey-based piece of work. So people called an 0800 number if they were interested in taking part, and I sent them a survey. So, and a lot of the phone calls I got were from women who were 65 plus, who had thought that they were experiencing this on their own, that nobody else, that this was specific to them, and other people didn't share their experience, and they were really surprised that other people might do and that they weren't on their own. And a lot of them talked about how they never had to drive the car before because in their relationship with their husbands or their partners, the partner was the one that did the driving. And that it wasn't until the partner or the husband got ill or passed away that they were forced to drive, and that was a significant source of anxiety for a lot of these women. So that was intriguing. And then, then I joined the Health and Ageing Research team, and that was something I was interested to follow up, and nobody else was really doing anything in terms of transport and mobility. And so that was something I took up. So the paper builds, I guess, on a previous paper where we were really just looking at the proportion of people in the cohort who reported driving anxiety, what kind of impact it had on their functioning, and then this was a subsequent paper to that.
Okay, so maybe we can start off with you've spoken about driving anxiety. What's the experience? What's the range of experience that falls into that category of driver anxiety?
Yeah, so it is a spectrum of experience from people who are more mildly anxious, which might, I guess, in this particular population of older adults could be related to a number of things. Cognitive function, physical function, ability to move their heads and check blind spots and things like that. Through to more, this was a place where I had a near miss or a crash, and that causes some anxiety. I guess if you're thinking about from a more global population point of view, or broader age range, driving anxiety is on a continuum from very mild anxiety that doesn't impact on somebody's functioning. So people might be mildly anxious for a particular reason, but that doesn't stop them from driving and doing what they need to do. Right through to people whose experience might be more described by a much more severe experience of anxiety or fear or phobia, or it might be a part of another kind of experience like panic disorder, agoraphobia, those kinds of things, or PTSD if it is related to having a vehicle crash, a serious vehicle crash, and everything in between. So, people will have significant anxiety in specific situations, and have difficulty in those specific situations, but it doesn't necessarily stop them from driving. Or people will avoid those particular situations and take a different route to avoid a specific place, or not drive at night, or not drive in bad weather or on the open road, right through to the other extreme where people won't drive. They will walk, cycle, take public transport, rely on friends and family for their mobility to get around if they're really severely affected by this.
So I guess in the example you were talking about previously, a couple of reasons there might be lack of experience, recent experience, because often it was the male partner who had been doing the driving, or the other partner, and also lack of confidence around that. Yes. As a result of lack of experience. And then there's other things you mentioned there, so something perhaps quite traumatic, to yes. worrying about physical functioning.
Yes.
How is it that I'm actually going to go about the task of driving? There's something that's in the way of that, or some kind of perhaps loss of faculty in being able to do that.
Yes, and I guess, the other thing in general is that we discovered in earlier parts of the research program were that some people also were focused on particular experiences like having panic attacks in the car. So that was another reason. One thing that hadn't been really discovered until the earlier research was that there was also significant concern that some people had about that was more socially related. So some people had quite significant concerns about annoying other drivers, or driving in a way that would inconvenience other people, or driving anger, people getting angry with them, and kind of road rage, fear of road rage, that had situations where they were, they weren't driving fast enough on the road or something, and being honked at, and having unpleasant social situations, and just worrying about getting in the way of other people, or driving in a way that wasn't that was annoying other drivers.
It's interesting you brought that up. It was something I was going to bring up with you. And you say that's something that's come up more recently, this fear of either aggravating other drivers, either by your driving or getting into some kind of confrontation where there's aggression that's quite apparent.
Yes. So when I did my master's research and my PhD as well, that was something that hadn't really been identified before, but that was quite a big concern of the participants, that there was this sort of social aspect to their fear. So, they were worried about what other people thought of their driving and annoying other drivers. And in some cases, for some people, driving anxiety can cross all of those areas. So their fear might be, it's not something that's typically a single underlying reason for the fear. It's often a multiple things like social concerns, fear of having an accident, fear of having uncontrollable anxiety symptoms while driving. It's often a mixture of all of those things together. So it's not in terms of a diagnostic, thinking about it from a diagnostic perspective, it often cuts across different categories of anxiety disorders. Rather than sort of neatly sitting into, say, PTSD or panic disorder or social phobia or something like that.
Yes. It's interesting what you were talking about just then, because I guess it's quite subtle, it's quite nuanced, this idea of being perceived as being a bad driver rather than necessarily, and I think disentangling that from perceiving aggression from other drivers. There's something that's quite self-referential about being perceived as a bad driver, isn't there?
Yes, and I think people who have a tendency to be anxious do often focus on themselves and their own experiences and how that might come across to other people. So often are quite concerned about what other people think and how other people will respond and react.
So I'm just thinking about how many people, what kind of proportion of a population experience driving anxiety, and is the older adult population different to the general population?
Well, that's a really good question, and we haven't. There hasn't been any research at the moment in terms of a general across all age groups that has answered that question. I have done one small piece of work on that, but it wasn't a representative population group. The only data we have is from the Health and Ageing Research Team, and the proportion of people and at that stage, the data that was collected were for young older adults, so the cohort was 55 to 72. And there were about 20% of that group reported mild driving anxiety, and about 5 to 6% endorsed driving anxiety that was more in the moderate to severe range. I've just done we're just working on some research with the University of Otago with another cohort of older drivers, and it's looking like we haven't done any robust analyses yet because the data's just being screened and checked and things, but it's looking like the rates of driving anxiety is slightly higher in that group. I'm just trying to find my notes on that. Slightly higher, so about instead of 5 to 6% with moderate to severe anxiety, something like 10 to 11%. But that's an older group as well, so they are all over 65. And we're not really quite sure why that is or what's going on there, but that's what we're investigating in that piece of work.
It sounds like you've hit a pretty rich vein here, given that there's so much that's not really known about driving anxiety and comparing these kind of like younger, older adults with the rest of the population. That's really curious.
Yes, it is. So we're really looking there at what are and we're just looking at another study that enables us to follow up this cohort to look more at what are the things that are what are the sort of pathways, I suppose, that older adults go through in terms of their decisions to stop driving, because we know that the literature says that older adults who stop driving are much more likely to experience a whole host of not so good outcomes. So they have increased health problems. They have increased impacts on their social ability to engage in various activities in the community, and it also impacts their mortality rate. So it is, we're trying to, I guess, identify the kinds of things that make people more vulnerable to not so good outcomes from driving cessation, and also the people who have good outcomes from stopping driving, and how they're different, so that we can try and mitigate some of those not so good outcomes that the literature says happen to older adults when they stop driving.
Let's explore that a bit more. But first, I'd like you to tell me about the paper that we've picked today. So, what is it that you were trying to do? I guess you were looking specifically at the impacts of driving anxiety on the health and well-being of these younger and older adults. Tell me about how you went about looking at answering that question.
Yeah, so we had this was some data that was collected from the Health and Ageing Research Team cohort, and we had this information about their ratings of driving anxiety, the degree of driving anxiety they self-reported, and also the subsequent ratings of their health and well-being that they reported in that survey too. So we were really just looking at, for the first time, to what degree was this experience of driving anxiety linked up, I suppose, with health and quality of life outcomes. So we'll be able to do this in a more longitudinal way with the subsequent waves of data collection in much the same way as we're doing with Otago University. But this paper in particular was just really looking at exploring what are these relationships like. Does driving anxiety explain any of the outcomes in health and well-being, health and quality of life, over and above the sort of big picture variables like socio-demographic variables, which often account for quite a lot of the variance in things like, in health, physical, mental health, and quality of life. So we were just looking at did it have much of an impact on those key health and well-being variables in this group.
Yeah, so this is part of a longer and bigger study on the health and well-being of older adults. And in this one time point, you looked at around about 2,500, 2,400 younger older adults. And
right, yeah.
And looking at the relationship between their driver anxiety self-rating,
yes,
and their mental and physical health and quality of life.
Yes, yeah.
And so what did you find?
Well, there was a small effect. So it wasn't, as we probably would have imagined, it did have driving anxiety was associated with poorer mental health and physical health and quality of life, and that was over and above the effect of the socio-demographic variables, but it was a small amount of the variance. So it wasn't something that was large, having a big impact. It had a very small impact, but nevertheless it was there. And I guess the more interesting aspect of that was that typically in the research that I've done and the research that has been done elsewhere on driving anxiety, more women report driving anxiety. So it's a predominantly experience that's described by women. But in this older group, it was still reported more predominantly by women. But in terms of the impacts on mental health and quality of life in particular, the as the driving anxiety increased, so people who rated higher levels of driving anxiety, men and women were both more likely to have lower mental health and quality of life if they had higher levels of driving anxiety, but actually men had lower scores compared to women. Oh. So they seem to be more impacted by high levels of driving anxiety in terms of their mental health and their quality of life than women. So there seems to be something going on there about perhaps, being anxious about driving. Maybe that's got something to do with, the role that driving plays in the lives of men, and particularly in New Zealand, and issues of identity and role and functioning. That seems to have there seems to be something going on there that we're going to look more closely at.
I'm really interested in that. I mean, I guess we're really boiling down to what is the difference in meaning of driving for men and women? What does it represent for them? What does it enable them to do with their lives? And particularly, perhaps, as this cohort ages, then driving as an activity, perhaps in modern life, is seen very differently to perhaps when they learnt to drive, or perhaps were driving more in their lives.
Yes, I think so. And also, other literature would suggest too that women, there's different, I guess, women and men can have different views of the purpose of driving. So literature would suggest that women can often view driving as a practical, a way of meeting practical sort of needs, I suppose, like, meeting family and doing activities with family and friends, whereas men, the research suggests that men view driving as a more important in terms of independence and identity. So the research would suggest that there are some different, gendered views, I suppose, about the function and the purpose and the meaning of driving, and when you can't do that, what impact does that have? So that might be something that we need to think about when we're looking at what does this mean, and does this pan out when you look at the cohort as they age, and how people are getting through this process of driving cessation if that arises for them.
So I guess that brings us on to the key question, really. Who should care about this, Jo? What's the point of this, particularly this idea of driving cessation? As you said, I was taken by that in the paper.
Well, I think we should all care about it, because what we know is that there's a hugely aging population, that the people are driving in older age for longer. They're driving more kilometres than they ever used to. There's going to be more older drivers on the road. So I guess, there'll be more people to be supported to drive safely. But we also know that the impact of cessation is quite significant in terms of health, physical health, mental health, loneliness, mortality are all at increased risk for all those things is increased with driving cessation. So it is with an ageing population, it is a huge health concern and policy concern, really, to be thinking about how to best support our older adults to stay on the road as long as safely possible, because we know that has effects, positive effects on their health, their well-being. But also, if they need to stop or they need to self-regulate their driving, say to, stop driving at night, or if their visibility is their vision is deteriorating, or their ability to move their heads and check scanning and things like that, then they might need to self-regulate and restrict some aspects of their driving, but also for those who do need to stop. Given we know that there'll be more of those people and we know the impact that it can have, that will put huge pressure on our health system. And we need to know more about how to support people through that process in a way that mitigates the often not so good outcomes for them in terms of health and wellbeing. So I think it's huge relevance for lots of different government departments, Transport Agency, the Ministry of Transport, the Ministry of Health, all sorts of places. So I think it is a large issue that is that we need to be thinking about, because there will be health implications, I think, for lots of older adults.
I think you're right. I think what I was struck by was, I guess it would be interesting to drill more into the concept of driver anxiety as well, because as we're talking, I'm very struck by its multidimensional nature. It's around confidence. It's perhaps around familiarity with the environment that you're driving in, for the length of time that you're going to be driving for, and as you say, the time of day that you're going to be driving. So all of these factors start to play in to perhaps this anxiety, and perhaps there may be some, like you say, support around addressing some of that anxiety so that it does not lead to this premature driving cessation, which then has a knock-on impact upon their health and well-being and quality of life, with perhaps severe consequences and then increased load on the social welfare and health sectors.
Yes, and it is very multifaceted, and we know quite a bit about that in younger people, but we don't really know to what extent that extends to older adults in a robust sense. We don't have that information yet, so it would be good to get more of a sense for how much of it is. I think there is a lot of issues about confidence and self-confidence and levels of comfort. But what that exactly means, because that could be about all sorts of things. That could be about, my legs don't work as well as they used to. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to, do what I need to in an emergency, or my reaction times are slowing down, so I'm worried that I'm not going to be able to stop it quickly if I need to, or I'm getting lost and I'm not sure how to get home, or so there's as well as the women who have lost their husbands who are now required to drive. So there's all sorts of different potential issues that older adults might be talking about when they say they've lost confidence in their driving ability. It could be about physical functioning, it could be about cognitive functioning, could be about just their being thrust into situations that aren't familiar to them, or moving house and needing to learn about how to navigate around a new suburb or city or something like that. Or somebody moving from a rural area into the city to be closer to health services and things like that. So there's a variety of factors that might underlie somebody saying I've lost confidence in my ability to drive, or I'm nervous about driving. That could be dealt with in a whole range of different ways.
I think you've hit upon something else I was thinking about there was what are the alternatives for people who perhaps say actually driving's not for me anymore, where we have perhaps a scenario where we have increasing traffic. Car sales are still continuing, and even though we may be making the switch to different powered forms of vehicles or using self-drive cars or shared rides, there's still going to be a lot of traffic on the road. What are the alternatives for people who perhaps are living in these rural areas where there aren't that many public transport alternatives? Yet we know that when people stop being able to be mobile, and most often that's through driving, then what else can we be doing?
That's a really good question. And I think it is a big issue. I also think the issue about driving as part of the psyche and the identity of people in New Zealand is another issue too, because I think like I said, particularly for men, although also for some women too, giving up the keys is a major blow to people's sense of self. And I think in New Zealand, the sort of typical view is that, you've got to drive. That's part of being a Kiwi, is getting out and driving and on the open road and exploring the country and things like that. So I think it, compared to a big city where it's much more the norm to be using public transport because it's such a vast expanse of, how else are you going to get around because there's so many other barriers to using a car. I don't think that's so much the case in New Zealand. I think there's still a lot of identity bound up in driving in New Zealand. So I think that there, a lot of people will resist that because of that issue, and that's what Kiwis do. They drive, they get behind the wheel. But I think it is an important issue about what alternatives are there and how are we building the infrastructure to support that. Because, in a lot of places, public transport isn't very good and isn't accessible or easy to use or convenient for anybody. And we do need to start thinking creatively about how that might be addressed soon.
The last point I was just thinking about as you were talking was, what we could end up with is, as you say, people have driving as perhaps a core part of their identity. It's essential to what it is to being a Kiwi. What we could end up with is a whole cohort of actually quite ambivalent drivers who, despite their anxiety, it's not enough for them to stop driving, yet they're still quite worried whilst they're out driving. And I think that that's something that we all have to bear in mind, especially as that population is getting older and is continuing to drive, and it's quite a large proportion of the population. It has implications for everybody using those roads. Yes,
absolutely. Yeah. That is a really complex topic with all sorts of layers, I think, and different. Yeah, I think culture plays a role in there too, as we've been talking about. So I think there's a lot more work to be done.
Hey, thanks for watching. I hope this has been helpful to you and interesting. If it has been, don't forget to hit the like button or maybe even subscribe for my future psychology content. Thanks so much for joining me. There's some more coming up here in the end cards for you to enjoy. Go well, and thanks, and see you again.